might look at the headlines flashing across your screens tonight and see a story about numbers, specifically the number 67, but I am here to tell you that this is not a story about math. It is a story about fear. It is a story about the kind of quiet, suffocating pressure that builds up in the back hallways of the Senate office buildings when the cameras are turned off and the staff have been sent home. For weeks, the conventional wisdom in Washington, the things that people say to each other at dinner parties and in the green rooms of cable news studios, was that this simply could not happen. They told you that the partisan divide was too calcified, that the loyalty to the former president was too absolute, and that the idea of 17 Republicans breaking ranks was a fantasy born of desperate opposition. But if you have spent enough time covering this beat, if you have spent enough time watching how these senators actually move and think when they believe their own political survival is on the line, you know that loyalty in this town is a fluid concept. Tonight, what we are seeing is the breaking of a dam that held for years, not because of a sudden moral awakening, but because the calculus of power has fundamentally shifted. I want to take you inside what actually happened over the last few hours, because the public announcement is just the final ceremony of a process that has been churning violently out of sight. When we talk about the Senate reaching 67 votes to convict, we are talking about the most difficult threshold in American politics. The founders designed it to be nearly impossible for a reason. They wanted to ensure that a president could not be removed by a simple partisan majority. They demanded a consensus so broad that it would require a significant portion of the president's own party to turn against him. And for the longest time, the strategy from the defense team was simple and, frankly, effective. They did not need to win an argument on the merits. They did not need to prove innocence. All they needed to do was hold the line at 34. If they could keep just 34 senators in the fold, they could weather any storm. That was the firewall. That was the safety net. But tonight, that net has been shredded, and I want to explain to you why that matters, not just for Donald Trump, but for the future of the presidency itself. You have to understand the psychology of the Senate to understand this moment. These are 100 people who view themselves as individual power centers. They are not easily hurted, but they are also deeply, intensely risk-averse. The reason the whip count, that internal tally of who is voting which way, remained stagnant for so long was that no one wanted to be the first to jump. In political terms, there is safety in numbers, but there is death in isolation. If you are the lone Republican voting to convict, you are a target, you are primaried, you are exiled. But if you are one of 17, if you are part of a bloc that moves together, suddenly the dynamic changes. The reporting coming out of the cloakrooms tonight suggests that this is exactly what happened. It was not a trickle of defections, it was a coordinated release. A group of senators, likely led by the institutionalists who have privately complained about the chaotic nature of the party's direction for years, decided that they could not wait any longer. They realized that if they didn't move now, they would never move. And once that group committed, the stragglers, the ones who were sitting on the fence, wetting their fingers to see which way the wind was blowing, had no choice but to follow. This is the mechanic of the collapse. It is rarely a slow erosion. It is almost always a sudden structural failure. One moment the wall is standing, and the next it is rubble. And for the viewer watching at home, thinking about what this means for your vote or your trust in the system, it is crucial to recognize that this decision was likely not made on the floor of the Senate during a televised speech. It was made in private meetings, in encrypted text messages, and in hushed conversations in the elevators. The 67 votes are not just a tally. They represent a complete reconfiguration of the Republican Party's relationship with its most dominant figure. It means that the fear of the base, which has paralyzed the caucus for so long, was finally outweighed by a different kind of fear. Perhaps it was the fear of historical judgment. Perhaps it was the fear of the precedent being set. Or perhaps, and this is the most cynical but often the most accurate interpretation, it was the fear that the ship was sinking and it was time to find a lifeboat. When you look at the whip count that leaked tonight, you are seeing the result of weeks of intense, invisible lobbying. We often focus on the public testimony, the shouting matches in committees, the viral clips on social media. But the real work of conviction happens in the quiet counting. The majority leader and the minority leader have been playing a high-stakes game of poker. The defense team was betting everything on the idea that the party discipline would hold. They were making calls, threatening primary challenges, promising support, using every lever of influence they had to keep that number below 67. And for a while, it looked like it was working. But there is a tipping point in every political scandal where the weight of the evidence or the exhaustion of the defenders becomes too much to bear. What we are hearing is that the defense team simply ran out of leverage. They went to the well one too many times. You might be asking yourself how this happened so quickly. How did we go from a stalemate to a conviction threshold in the span of a single evening? The answer lies in the peculiar nature of the Senate as an institution. It functions on unanimity and tradition, but it also functions on momentum. Once the rumor started to spread that the dam was breaking, that the number was getting close to 65, then 66, the pressure on that 67th senator became immense. Nobody wants to be the deciding vote that saves a president who is going down, just as nobody wants to be the deciding vote that removes him if the effort is going to fail. But once the outcome became certain, once the internal count hit the magic number, the calculus flipped. Suddenly, senators who were staunch defenders yesterday are looking at their legacy today. They are looking at how history books will be written, and they are deciding that they do not want to be on the losing side of a historic vote. This is the hidden story of tonight. It is not just about the verdict. It is about the collapse of a political protection racket that has defined Washington for years. The system that was built to insulate the president from consequences has failed. And it failed not because of the opposition party, but because the president's own allies decided that the cost of maintenance was finally too high. As we move through the details of how this came to be, keep in mind that what we are watching is the system working exactly as it was designed, but in a way we almost never see. It is the assertion of the legislative branch's ultimate authority over the executive. It is a reminder that in the American system, no individual is bigger than the architecture of the government itself, but it is a messy, brutal, and deeply human process. It is about egos and grudges and future ambitions. And tonight, all of those messy human elements have aligned to produce a number that changes everything, 67. To understand the gravity of what is about to unfold, you have to look past the headline number and look at the machinery of the trial itself. When the Senate convenes as a court of impeachment, the rules of normal politics are supposed to be suspended. Senators swear a special oath to do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, an oath that is separate from the one they take when they are first sworn into office. For weeks, we have watched them sitting at their mahogany desks, stripped of their phones and their staff, forced to listen to the arguments from the House managers and the defense counsel. It is an archaic, solemn process, one of the few times in modern American life where these powerful figures are forced to be a captive audience. But while the public was watching the televised arguments, the real trial was happening in the cloakrooms and the dining rooms. The official story is that they were weighing the evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors. The reality, the one that actually drives outcomes in this town, is that they were weighing the political cost of inaction against the political cost of action. The vote to convict is not just a legal verdict, it is a political severance. It is the legislative branch taking a knife to the executive and cutting the cord. The process that got us here was messy and often confusing for the average voter trying to follow along between work and family obligations. We saw the initial charges in the House, the partisan bickering, and the breathless coverage of every procedural motion. But the core of this issue, the thing that finally moved the needle for those critical Republican senators, wasn't a specific legal technicality. It was a cumulative realization about stability. In my conversations with senior staffers on the Hill over the last few days, a theme emerged. They weren't talking about specific statutes or obscure precedents. They were talking about exhaustion. They were talking about the inability of the government to function under the constant weight of chaotic leadership. The argument that finally resonated with the holdouts wasn't about the past, it was about the future. It was the argument that the country simply could not afford another cycle of this specific brand of disruption. That is a hard thing for a politician to say in public, especially when their base is fired up. But in private, it is a powerful motivator. You might be wondering why the number 67 specifically matters so much. Why not just a majority? Why did the founders make this so difficult? They set the bar this high because they wanted to ensure that a removal from office would never be a partisan hit job. They wanted to make sure that if a president was removed, it was because the country, through its representatives, had reached a broad, undeniable consensus that he was unfit to serve. Achieving a two-thirds vote means that the verdict is bipartisan by definition. It strips away the defense that this is just a witch hunt or a democratic coup. When you have 17 members of the president's own party walking down into the well of the Senate and voting guilty, that argument evaporates. It provides a kind of political cover for everyone involved. The Democrats can say they followed the law, and the Republicans who flipped can say they were compelled by the overwhelming nature of the case, rather than admitting they were making a strategic calculation to reclaim their party. But let's bring this back to what it means for you. It is easy to look at Washington as a distant, broken place that has nothing to do with your daily life. You worry about grocery prices, about your kids' schools, about whether your job is safe. A Senate trial feels like a reality TV show that never ends. But the reason this matters, the reason you should care about a whip count in a building hundreds of miles away, is that the stability of the presidency dictates the stability of the entire system. When the executive branch is paralyzed by scandal or fighting for its survival, the actual work of government stops. Agencies don't get direction, problems don't get solved, crises don't get managed. The decision these senators are making tonight is effectively a decision to reset the operating system of the federal government. They are deciding that the current glitch is fatal and that a reboot is necessary. It is a terrifying moment because it is so rare, but it is also a moment where the system is trying to correct itself. The build-up to this night has been a slow-motion collision between political loyalty and institutional self-preservation. We watched the defense team try to paint the proceedings as unconstitutional, as a sham, as a waste of time. They tried to distract with procedural hurdles and aggressive rhetoric. For a long time, it seemed like the strategy of delay and deflect would work. They counted on the short attention span of the media and the public. They counted on the idea that if they just yelled loud enough, the details would get lost in the noise. But something shifted in the last week. The evidence presented wasn't new, but the context had changed. The private polling that senators rely on started to show cracks in the base. Donors started to close their checkbooks. The feedback loop that usually keeps the party in lockstep began to fracture. And in that fracture, the House managers found their opening. They stopped trying to shame the Republicans and started giving them an off-ramp. They started framing the vote not as a betrayal of the president, but as a rescue mission for the party and the country. That was the pivotal strategic shift. They gave the wavering senators permission to jump. So how did that permission structure actually work in practice? It wasn't a single speech that changed minds. It was a series of quiet, brutal conversations about political mortality. Sources involved in the whip operation describe a suicide pact strategy. It is a grim term, but it is the only way to describe the mechanics of a mutiny in the Senate. The moderate Republicans who wanted to convict knew they could not survive if they trickled out one by one. They would be picked off by primary challengers and right-wing media. So they formed a bloc. They effectively told leadership, "I will give you my vote, but only if you can guarantee you have 16 others standing right next to me." It became a game of chicken with their own consciences. They needed safety in numbers, and for the first time in this entire saga, they actually found it. This is where the role of the Senate leadership becomes critical, and it is the part of the story that is often hardest to see from the outside. The leaders act as the clearinghouse for this information. They are the only ones who know the full count. For the last 48 hours, the minority leader's office has effectively been a confessional. Senators were walking in, closing the door, and asking the same question. Is it real? Do we actually have the numbers? They didn't want to cast a protest vote. They didn't want to make a symbolic gesture that would ruin their careers for nothing. They wanted to know that if they pulled the trigger, the target would actually fall. Once the leadership could look them in the eye and confirm that the threshold had been met, that the 67 votes were locked in, the hesitation vanished. The fear of being a traitor was replaced by the fear of being left behind on a sinking ship. You have to appreciate the specific arguments that were being traded in those rooms. It wasn't about high-minded constitutional theory. It was about the cold, hard reality of the election calendar. The argument that finally cut through the noise was about the future of the party's ability to win general elections. The quiet consensus building among the donor class and the political strategists was that the former president had become an electoral albatross. They argued that while the base loves him, the suburbs have abandoned him, and without the suburbs, the party is doomed to a permanent minority status. This is the rip the Band-Aid off argument. It suggests that a conviction, while painful and chaotic in the short term, is the only way to clear the field for a new generation of leaders. It is a ruthless calculation, treating a presidency like a bad investment that needs to be written off. But it is the kind of calculation that resonates with people who have spent their lives trying to acquire and hold power. Let's talk about the mechanics of the vote itself, because this is where the drama will play out on your screen. The Senate rules are rigid. When the roll is called, each senator must stand at their desk and verbally cast their vote. There is no hiding. There is no electronic board where you can press a button and slip out the side door. You have to stand up and say guilty or not guilty, while the entire world, and more importantly, the former president, is watching. This public nature of the vote is what kept the number low for so long. But the whip count we are seeing tonight tells us that the fear of that public moment has been overcome by the assurances of the group. The 17 Republicans who are crossing the line are likely a mix of 3 distinct groups, and understanding who they are explains how we got here. First, you have the retirees. These are the senators who are not seeking re-election. They are liberated. They don't have to worry about a primary challenge from the MAGA wing. They are thinking about their obituaries. For them, this is a legacy vote. They were the easiest to get, the low-hanging fruit. Second, you have the institutionalists, the senators who believe deeply in the traditions of the Senate and are genuinely offended by the attacks on the democratic process. They have been uncomfortable for years, and they finally decided that the damage to the institution was greater than the damage to their political standing. But the third group is the most surprising and the most critical. These are the pragmatic ambitious. These are the younger senators who want to be president one day. They have calculated that they cannot win a primary with Trump in the field, but they also cannot win a general election if they are seen as his enablers forever. They are gambling that by the time they run for higher office, the anger of the base will have faded, or at least shifted to a new target. They are betting on the collective amnesia of the American voter. This coalition of the willing, the retiring, and the ambitious is fragile. It is held together by a shared interest in moving on. But don't mistake this for a unified moral stance. If you look closely at the statements coming out, you will see a wide range of justifications. Some will cite specific evidence. Some will talk about the abstract idea of accountability. Some might even blame the process while still voting to convict. This is designed to muddy the waters, to give them something to say to their angry constituents back home. I didn't want to do it, they will say, but the facts left me no choice. It is a classic Washington two-step. Do the thing that needs to be done, but pretend you were dragged into it kicking and screaming. As we wait for the final roll call, think about the pressure cooker these individuals are in right now. Their phones are blowing up. The switchboards in their DC offices are jammed. The grassroots machine is in overdrive, trying to peel off just 1 or 2 votes to break the supermajority. But the information we have is that the leadership has done its job. They have insulated the defectors. They have likely promised fundraising support, committee chairmanships, and air cover from friendly media outlets to help them weather the storm. This is how the sausage is made. It isn't pretty, and it certainly isn't pure, but it is effective. The machinery of the party has turned against its leader, and once those gears start grinding, it is almost impossible to stop them. The magic number isn't just a statistic. It is the sum of 1,000 compromises, threats, and deals made in the dark, all leading to this one blinding moment of clarity. The system is purging itself, and we are all just watching the operation from the gallery. Now, I want to talk about the architects of this moment, because while the senators are the ones casting the votes, they didn't get there alone. You have to look at the signal callers who sit outside the chamber but hold the keys to the kingdom. We need to talk about the donor class and the media ecosystem because their fingerprints are all over this result. For years, the arrangement was simple. The donors provided the fuel, the media provided the cover, and the politicians provided the votes. But reporting from the last 2 weeks indicates that the fuel line was cut. Major bundlers, the people who underwrite the entire Republican operation, started making quiet phone calls to leadership. The message was blunt. Move on, or we close the checkbook. You cannot overstate how much that terrified the caucus. These are politicians who spend half their waking hours fundraising. When the money talks in Washington, it screams. And what it screamed this week was that the cost of doing business with the former president had become too high. This shift in the financial landscape gave the Senate leadership the permission structure they needed. We have to be clear about the role of the minority leader here. He is a man who rarely speaks unless he has already won the argument. His silence over the last few weeks was deafening, and it was interpreted correctly by his caucus as a green light. He didn't have to whip the votes for conviction personally. He just had to stop whipping against it. He effectively released his members to vote their conscience, which is Senate code for do what you need to do to survive. By removing the threat of leadership retaliation, he removed the biggest structural barrier to reaching 67. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, a way of steering the ship without ever touching the wheel where the cameras could see. On the other side of this equation, you have the defense team, and frankly, we have to look at their malpractice. They walked into the Senate chamber acting like they were at a campaign rally. They played to an audience of 1, their client, rather than the audience of 100 who actually held the verdict in their hands. Sources close to the whip count tell me that several wavering senators were deeply offended by the tone of the defense. They felt talked down to. They felt that the arguments were intellectually insulting. When you tell a room full of lawyers and constitutional scholars that the rules don't apply to your guy, you better have the votes locked down beforehand. The defense team assumed the partisan firewall was impenetrable, so they didn't bother to build a substantive case. They didn't see that the ground was shifting beneath their feet until it was too late. Their arrogance became a permission structure of its own. It gave those on the fence a reason to say, I can't support this legal theory, rather than, I'm voting against the man. And then there is the media element. You have watched the coverage shift. You have seen the subtle pivot on the major conservative networks. It wasn't a sudden U-turn, but a gradual change in the weather. The primetime hosts started talking less about the sham trial and more about the future of the movement. They started floating the idea of a post-Trump party. This doesn't happen by accident. These talking points are tested. They are coordinated. It signaled to the base, and to the senators terrified of the base, that there might be life after a conviction. It lowered the temperature just enough to make a guilty vote survivable. When a senator goes home to their district, they need to know that the local radio host isn't going to call for their head on a spike. The softening of the media narrative provided that essential air cover. But we also have to be careful here to distinguish between what we know and what we are inferring. We know the vote count is there. We know the donors pulled back. We know the leadership stepped aside. But we don't know exactly what promises were made to secure the final few votes. Was there a deal on future legislation? Was there a guarantee of protection in the next primary cycle? In Washington, there is always a transaction. Nobody gives away a vote this valuable for free. The suicide pact I mentioned earlier likely came with an insurance policy attached. We may not see the terms of that deal for years, but you can be sure it exists.